Before I introduce our speaker, let us bow our heads, remembering all who have gathered in this room. In a spirit of praise and thanks, we say, God, our Creator, you sustain our lives through the gift of your Spirit and the following of Jesus. Stir in us the desire to learn, to love, to serve more generously, to act on behalf of justice and truth. We ask these blessings in your holy name. Amen. I told Monsignor that I would keep it very short. Many of you do know Monsignor Zuraw. He is a native of Campbell, an Ursuline High School graduate, and has been a priest in the diocese since being ordained in 1987. He has a license in canon law since 1999. He has held various positions throughout the diocese. Most recently, he was appointed Vicar General. He's had many ministerial assignments and is currently the pastor of St. Charles and St. Luke parishes in Boardman. Please welcome my friend and pastor, Monsignor John Zuraw.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think they're going to have to tone this down just a little bit. I'm like Darth Vader up here. The topic that we're going to discuss a little bit this afternoon is entitled The Challenge of Being a 21st Century Catholic. And I used the word challenge or challenges because when challenges come into our lives, we have to realize that there are opportunities for growth. So when we discuss the topic this afternoon of challenges of being a 21st century Catholic, we begin with a concept that what we're going to discuss this afternoon, it's an opportunity for each and every one of us to grow stronger in our faith. So we begin with that simple word Catholic. And each and every one of us has various definitions as to what talks most to us about the word Catholic. We might identify ourselves with the phrase before Catholic as Roman Catholic. But when we use that phrase Catholic, we look at the word Catholic as being all-embracing. It's universal. It's in accord with the whole. So we look at our Catholic history. And our Catholic history has been pretty good. You know, we've been salt and light. We've been faithful and fruitful. We have been blessed, and we have blessed others. And we also have to realize that as much good as there is in the Catholic Church, there have been moments that have been not so edifying. And I go back to the 19th century, and Pius IX is elected Pope. And Pius IX had a nickname, and his nickname was Pio Nono, N-O-N-O. Because anything that was modern, he said no to. He was anti-modern. He died in 1878. And the church at that point was at its lowest level. The cardinals even said, let's move the papal election to Malta so that we would be protected by the British Navy. So that tells us, you know, what the anti-modern sentiment brought forth to the church. But those cardinals remained strong, and they elected Leo XIII. He was 68 years old when he was elected. And these cardinals presumed that he would sit on the chair of St. Peter and simply keep it warm. But he did no such thing. He set a renewal of the church until his death when he was 93. He understood clearly that unless we change, we cannot live. Pope Leo's advice to the church was simply to reclaim, not to regress. So today, as we gather as the church, there are 4 questions that basically I would like us to examine. 4 questions that I want each and every one of us to think about and to simply say, how do these questions affect me today? And more importantly, how are these questions going to create a future for each and every one of us? So the first question is, who am I as a 21st century Catholic? How do I see myself? Where is the church in the 21st century? That's the second question. Where are we going as church? And the final question basically is, who is going with us? Are there going to be companions on the journey or not? So I'm going to tell you a little story about 3 sisters. These 3 biological sisters were well into their 90s, and they began to forget a little bit. So one of those sisters was in the bathroom. She had 1 foot in the tub and 1 foot outside the tub. And she screams to her second sister, "I'm not sure whether I'm getting in the tub or out of the tub." So her second sister begins to run up the steps. She stops at the landing and she thinks to herself, am I going up the steps or down the steps? The third sister, she's at the table. And she's just amazed at those 2 other sisters. And she says to God, thank God I'm not like those other 2. Knock on wood, I still have my mind. And that's what she did. She knocked on the table. And she thought to herself, is that the front door or the back door? So when we look at ourselves as church, we're very much like those sisters. We're not sure whether we're coming or going. There is so much rapid change. For some of us, the old guidelines or the certainties seem to be gone. So I want you to picture another situation. There was an old-time Irish man by the name of Mickey Murphy. He has a heart attack on the street. He calls for the priest to give him the last rites. A lady rushes over to him, bends down, and says to him, "Don't be alarmed. I used to be a priest, but I got dispensed. An emergency, I can give you the last rites. I carry the oil in my purse." And Mickey screams out in a loud voice, "Saints preserve us, get me a real priest." As luck has it, there was another priest on the street. He rushes over to Mickey. Mickey looks up as the priest bends down to anoint him. The priest pushes aside his long blonde hair, revealing an earring. The sun catches the priest's face, and Mickey squints until he makes out where that earring actually is. It's not in the ear, but in the nose. And what does Mickey say? if the church has come to this, I'm ready for God and I'm ready for God now. So that little phrase often appears in each of our minds. God, if it has come to this, I'm ready for you and I'm ready for you now. So we need to ask ourselves then that first question. What do we as 21st century Catholics look like? Do we have a Catholic identity or a more Christian generic identity? Catholics of all ages are grappling with how to preserve a sense of who they are. You know, we live in a secular culture, and we're living in a culture of choice and change. We're living in a culture where people are constructing their membership within the church as their own personal preference. So I think it's important for each and every one of us to try to understand that within each and every generation within the church, as the body of Christ, there is significance. But each and every generation has something different. Each and every generation has something to offer. The beauty of the Catholic Church is that we are all embracing. We are universal. But we have to realize that in order to care for one another, as St. Paul encourages each and every one of us to do, that we have to understand individuals' characteristics. We have to explore the uniqueness of individuals' needs. Each and every generation lives in the same church, but their experiences are not always the same. So this afternoon, as we begin to answer that first question, who are we as 21st century Catholics? We need to divide the generational gap into three main areas. Before Vatican II, and I use the word before instead of pre-Vatican II, because pre-Vatican II has negative connotations. So it's before Vatican II. It's Vatican II, and then post-Vatican II. Before Vatican II, individuals that were born in 1945 or earlier. How best do we describe that generation? They're the elders. They're the builder generation. They're the silent generation. Or what I have entitled this generation as being, there are wisdom figures. We realize that this is the fastest growing segment of the population. They're identified as being very nationalistic, love of God, love of country. They value economic security. That generation saves everything. We realize that there's going to be a time in which we're going to need that bottle cork. So not only do we save one, we save 100 of them. That generation has a strong family value. That generation is not so much excited about change, but they're very hard-working. When it comes to authority, especially church authority, they're very loyal. They accept authority. They appreciate the institutional church. This generation favors absolutes. They are the generation that society has deemed as a generation that gets things done. We have to realize that 75% of the nation's wealth is in their hands. They like to give generously to the church and to charity. They're most comfortable with activities that are structured and they have purpose. This is the generation that comes to the church, where the church celebrates the Eucharist in the Latin language when they were growing up, where the priest has his back to the people. This is the generation that experienced the mindset that you go to Mass, and if you don't go to Mass, you go to hell. This is the generation that basically taught other generations that Sunday's a day of rest. How many of you basically grew up in a household where on Sunday you could not even use a pair of scissors because that articulated to us that we're working? You know, these are the Catholics whose parents or grandparents immigrated to the United States. So that's that generation. But along with that generation, those wisdom figures, we have to realize is that there is another group that was born before Vatican II. And we call them the baby boomer generation. Years of 1946 to 1964. But what these individuals is that there's a shift in values. There's a shift in attitude. There is a shift in belief. That group called the baby boomers, and I'm part of that group. So I look at myself in the mirror when I'm articulating about this group. They're very individualistic. They're dominant. And they master everything that they touch. For this group, we have to realize is that success not only includes wealth, but emotional and psychological happiness. The best way in which we can describe this group is it is the me generation. If I'm happy, everybody's happy. If I'm not happy, the rest of you are miserable. Like the three sisters, this generation has one foot in the Latin Mass, the other has another foot in the vernacular. This generation moved from the pray, pay, and obey mindset to a mindset within the church that we're the people of God. We're the community of believers. Whether they understood that we are the people of God or the community of believers, that's a different story. But what's more important is they have moved from the pray, pay, and obey mentality. They favor change, but as long as that change basically is positive for me. This group of baby boomers, education is most important. Leadership they favor is individuals that are driven. Their worshiping experience is an experience of multitude options. They are a spiritually searching generation. They don't see themselves as being bound by rules, but they're more interested in the environment. And what I mean by that is the comfortable environment. So we move now into the Vatican II generation, Generation X, the MTV generation, those born in 1965 to 1980. You know, things changed during that generation. There are more dual family incomes, more single family units. They're more children of divorce. They are described as the latchkey generation. This generation is more likely to be less involved in organized religion, and they're more liberal on social issues. You know, this X generation came into play during the emergence of the AIDS epidemic. They lived through the height of the government's war on drugs with the phrase, "Just say no." This group is more cynical and less pessimistic. They're suspicious of leaders who are smooth talkers, who have big visions. This group is the group that only knows the Mass in the vernacular. This is the group that was very fond of John Paul II. They turned out in record numbers for his masses, for his rallies. But even though they cheered on John Paul II, they tended to ignore his pleas for sexual abstinence, natural family planning, going to Mass, and confession on a regular basis. So now we move to the post-Vatican II, the millennial generation, or Generation Y. Individuals born in 81 to 96. They're described as being less cynical, though, a little more confident. They value motivation. But what we have to be very careful of is this group has no interest in institutions. They have grown up in an age of technology. They're focused on God and spirituality, but they're not focused on institutions. They identify themselves with concern for the poor, the environment, and the common good. The two biggest issues for these groups of individuals, the millennials, regarding the Catholic Church, are the issues of women's ordination and the way the Church treats the LGBTQ question people. They're the first generation of a digital world. Their world was turned upside down by 9/11. As Catholics, they were shaken by the sexual abuse issues that began in 2002. The second generation that is post-Vatican II, and I see your next speaker next month will be speaking on this Generation Z, beginning in the year 1997. Instead of looking ahead to a world of opportunity, we realize that Generation Z now peers into an uncertain future. This group is ethnically diverse. They're probably the most well-educated of all generations. They have no knowledge of a world before smartphones. They're more likely to have college-educated parents than any other previous generation. The interesting part of this group is that they are less likely to work as teenagers and young adults. The parents of this Generation Z did less to encourage regular participation in any formal worship service. Many of those childhood activities that most of us grew up with, such as the common practice of saying grace before meals, this is alien to this Generation Z. So that answers our first question. Who are we then as 21st century Catholics? You know, that's who we are. That's the wealth and the richness that is brought forth by each of these groups, each of these generational groups of individuals. So the second question then that we need to ask ourselves today, so where are we today? How are we identified as Catholics in the United States? Where have we gone and where are we now? We've gone from a faith community to a loss of Catholic subculture. We have gone from religious imagination to radical individualism. We've gone from a visible hierarchical structure to a loss of credibility. We've gone from a theology to theological illiteracy. So let's just take a few moments and identify a little more about where we have been and where we are. So when we talk about a faith community and the loss of a subculture within the Catholic milieu, we realize that the culture of Catholics at one time was vast and it was all embracing. Catholic life centered on the local parish. And Catholics were insulated from the surrounding area, from where you went to school, to who you married, to the weekly devotional practices, which included confession and novenas, benediction, and Marian devotions. In time, Catholics moved from the traditional urban areas to the suburbs, from ethnic parishes to larger suburban parishes, from going to Catholic schools to other opportunities of education, from only marrying Catholics to marrying non-Catholics and even non-believers. So the faith community has changed. Our Catholic identity has also changed from religious imagination to radical individualism. How do we describe religious imagination? Religious imagination has to deal with our experience with the sacred. It has to deal with how we see God. One's religious imagination is shaped by one's personal culture, our traditions, our devotions, our dogma. Finding God rooted in the imagination is where richness, in fact, does blossom. Think about your favorite color. Think about why that color is your favorite color. Now think about walking into some of our churches. Whether those churches are built in the 1800s, the early 1900s, whether or not those churches were built in the 50s, 70s, 80s, or 2000s. Think about the art that, is in those churches. Think about the color of art. Think about what color churches are painted. And what we have to realize is that, through those sacred objects, the Catholic imagination, our imagination, has been enriched. What we have to be very careful of is that our imaginations and our favorite color simply doesn't become beige. How many of you named beige as your favorite color? Nobody. Okay, beige is boring, okay? It's clean, but it's boring. It goes with everything, but it's boring. The Catholic imagination invites us to see the beauty that is around us. Our Catholic imagination invites each and every one of us to see God at work in the world. God is not beige. So once again, we have moved from a Catholic imagination rich to a radical individualism. That if I'm all right with Jesus, I don't need the church. We hear the phrase, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. There is a systematic gap between what the church teaches and what Catholics believe and do. A significant number of individuals no longer see the Catholic Church as unique. Many of them say that they can be good Catholics without going to Mass. That being Catholic is not expressed by being a part of a Catholic community. The communal dimension of Catholicism is largely missing. Most members place the greatest emphasis on having a personal relationship with God and do not see the church, the community of believers, as being an essential component to their faith. We move now to a loss of credibility. So at one time, the hierarchical structure of the church kept us out of chaos. But now what's happening is that there's a crisis in credibility. Going back to the 2000s, it was not our finest hour. It maybe was our darkest hour. Everything that we trusted was lost. The abuse of children, youth, and vulnerable adults by some members of the clergy, and the cover-up by individuals in authority. Victims were deeply hurt. The sexual abuse crisis, in my opinion, is a symptom of something greater and deeper, which includes narcissism, entitlement mentality, and clericalism. When we talk a little bit about the Second Vatican Council, it's not about reorienting the church from a priest-run church. It's about focusing each and every one of us on the sacrament of baptism. St. Paul reminds us that there are many gifts, but the same Spirit. There are a variety of services, but the same Lord. There are a wide variety of activities, but the same God who empowers each and every one of us. That same Spirit is for the common good. We talk a little bit then from a theology to theological illiteracy. We talk a little bit about theology, and we each have our own little study and definition of theology. It's simply about the study of God and how God is revealed to the world and how we are in relationship with God. People of my generation, I'm going to be 63 on July 4th, okay? So I'm a firecracker baby, okay? We didn't learn a lot about doctrine. The catechesis that we received was more on engaging our emotions than challenging our intellect. And especially today, those enrolling in ministerial programs and even our seminaries often don't have a solid catechetical formation and less accurate knowledge about theological terms and concepts. I'm not talking about original sin. I'm not talking about the defining of incarnation. I'm not talking about the principles of the church's social teaching. Just simply phrases of what is sin? Who's God? Do I have a relationship with God? We have to be careful that once again, as faith-filled members, that we just don't simply say, I went through 8 years of Catholic school, so I know it all. Each and every day of our lives, we discover something new. So truly, a 21st century Catholic challenges all of us to discover something new each and every day of our faith and who we are and how we can live through that faith. So where are we going? For some of us, we said, okay, everything that you said seems to be like bad news. But there's good news. The good news is that there is good news, that we're the church. And together we constitute the church. So the good news is that we need to welcome. As church, we cannot divide. As the church of the 21st century, we realize that we are a multicultural society. That the church of the 21st century is speaking from weakness rather than power. The Catholics are just not looking at what particular parish they live in, but rather Catholicism is truly a way of life, a way of seeing the world. Recently, the church participated in the process of synodality. And, looking at some of the remarks that are brought forth, they're remarkable. Because once again, we're rediscovering that we are truly the body of Christ, that we need to reach out to those who are less fortunate. Our tradition truly speaks of who we are. We're the largest non-governmental provider of social services. Our school system, both private and secondary, they play an important part, especially for those students who are poor and come from minority groups. Our schools have the lowest dropout rate and the greatest number that go on to post-secondary education. As a church, we still have a lot to offer. Yesterday, we celebrated, the Feast of the Visitation of Mary. And truly, the gospel reading brings into light the best image of the 21st century Catholic. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. You've looked at my lowliness, but you have done great things for me. As a 21st century Catholic, we have to act in justice. We have to love tenderly. We gotta walk humbly with God. So we have to ask ourselves, who's going to go with us? Who's going to walk with us? Pope Francis stated that we're living in a change of era, not of an era of change. Think about communications. It seems like if the newborn babies are coming out of the womb with smartphones in their little hands. Observe the longevity of life. Those individuals who were born in 1850, they lived to about 45 years of age. Individuals born in 2000, they will live beyond 85. if you're born in 2050, experts say that you will live beyond 100 and even closer to 200. I don't want to work to 200. Today we realize that Jesus was no fool. He chose 72 individuals to go out 2 by 2, hand in hand. You know, most of us and most of life depends upon the company we keep. We need one another. We rely on one another. We need communities, and we need to create communities that welcome, support, and inspire. We pay the price when the sense of God's hand is no longer with us. We go back to the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless void. Darkness covered the abyss. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And everything that God created was good. I began with Leo the 13th. Let's finish with him. Nothing is more useful than to look upon the world as it really is, and at the same time, to seek the possibilities of what it can be. So as 21st century Catholics, we need to ask ourselves, or we need to remember 2 questions. Do I know what I do not know? And where are the people who know what I do not know? Defining who we are and what we do and don't know are essential. What we do know is that we are baptized believers. That's who we are. We're in this together. That our mission comes forth from the gospel. We are living at an opportune time. This is a great moment in time. It's a time for silence, stillness, and prayer. But it's time also for compassion, mission, and action. To sum it up, the challenge of being a 21st century Catholic lies in the fact that we still have not taken seriously our baptismal bonding, calling us to full, conscious, and active participation. As a typical Catholic, we fail to recognize the deep continuity of the treasures of our tradition. The challenge that is set forth is not regression, but in various ways to reclaim. Not to go back to repeat, but build upon the wisdom of the church. So what is the greatest challenge of being a 21st century Catholic? One phrase and one phrase only: to remain balanced. Thank you. Questions? No hard questions. And it's great if you don't have any questions, because then you can go home and cut grass. You know, anything, something about the talk, or, once again, part of my responsibility is this regional plan. Whatever you'd like to ask. You got complaints, I'll take complaints. Okay, we got a complaint.
Speaking about the challenges, there are a lot of challenges that I have to think about with change, but specifically, what if I were a Catholic in Los Angeles
Right. Right. And I think the most important, from my opinion, which I think you have a very valid question, is that, there is a theological illiteracy out there. So as individuals, we need to balance our theological studies, to make sure that the resources that we are reading, the resources that are incorporating into our daily life is balanced. Because, in every aspect of our lives, you got the far right, you got the far left. And I think it's important as Catholics, and this is what Jesus promoted. He promoted a balanced approach to life. So, once again, what does the church teach on the issue, which is, vitally important? The second aspect is that we are open to dialogue or discussion, but by opening dialogue and discussion, there's also an opportunity for us to make our point come across in a very clear and concise way. So the one challenge that basically, with everything that's going on in the world, is that we need to be well informed. And, the sources that we, study from are sources that are good sources, right sources, sources that might not have their own particular agenda. Sometimes it's great for us to, look at certain things that basically either are to the far right or the far left, because it's entertaining. It makes us look at, our balanced approach as being life-giving. Because if you go too far to one side or the other side, you're stifling your life. But if you remain in the center and if you remain, core to that which, the church teaches, we have opportunities for greater growth. Does that help? Or did it answer? Yeah, not good to be well balanced, right. And that's in all aspects of our life. That the physical depends upon the emotional depends upon the spiritual. Think of that word holy. What does it mean to be holy? Does it mean that you're praying 25 Our Fathers and 10 Hail Marys? Holiness has to deal with every aspect of your life being in unison. Your physical, your spiritual, and your psychological. That's what a holy person is. That's what Jesus was. No question. This is mass check. Now remember, you're from St. Charles, so you got to be kind, because I don't want to be fired.
I don't think, okay. Now you mentioned, Monsignor, that the Second Vatican Council was all about baptism.
It's our call to baptism.
Our call to baptism.
To once again renew our call to
yes.
baptism.
Now, from what I understand in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that we as lay people have been baptized into the priesthood. And this, and I understand that that's our call to mission. But in some ways, I think because, now let me ask your opinion, has this call to baptism into the priesthood as lay people, has this affected vocations?
I don't think so. Because if you look at any mainline church, they're also having a crisis of individuals going into ministry. I think the crisis is more a crisis of commitment than a crisis of vocation. So the call to baptism, that we are called to be a priestly people, a holy people, a people set apart, gives even more emphasis of our responsibility to encourage others, whether that be the ordained ministry, the religious life, or lay ministry. that we're working together as a unit in all of this. That, the one is not superior over the other, but we are the body of Christ, and that we need one another, and that we need to depend upon one another. I got 3 minutes.
I know that the Catholic Church's take on abortion is that it's absolutely wrong. But does that mean that we have to support the government saying there are laws that prohibit abortion?
And once again, those are some of the critical items that, we start with our basic principle that it is wrong. And part of our responsibility is then to take the responsibility of taking all the aspects of life and, in all honesty, looking at life and the dignity of life. Okay? And this is my own little personal observation. When the abortion was allowed, okay, when it became part of law that, you could commit abortion, in those recent years, see how individuals began to look at all aspects of life. See how then that one law created a lack of respect for all generations. See how, that one law had an effect on how individuals look at themselves. Why within society today can individuals truly say, I can take your life? Because life no longer has the respect and dignity that it once did. So, that one law affected all the dimensions of life. That goes from, our young people to our teenagers to even our senior citizens, and, how those individuals are treated. Are we treating individuals at all aspects of life with the respect and dignity necessary? So it goes back truly to that one law, and how that evolved into a much more serious concern as to how individuals truly look and respect one another. That's how I see it. Being a pastor of a school, which I enjoy, it's truly, we have to lift our young people. They have to see the inner goodness in themselves. When they look in the mirror each and every day, probably 90% look at a face and say, this is wrong with me, this is wrong with me. I don't like my nose, I don't like my hair, I don't like my eyebrows, I don't like my lips. And I encourage our young people, when you look in that mirror each and every day, you got to find something that you like about yourself, because that's truly going to make the difference for the entire day. If you start negative, you're going to end negative. If you start positive, hopefully positivity will include and move forward. Those are just my opinions. That and 2 cents will not even get you a cup of coffee. Okay? I am finished.
Thank you very much for coming and for speaking with us. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next month. Remember to ask all of your youth and pastoral ministers to come for Tracy Lamont.